Hi again, I'm Roxanne Newman, Conference Producer for Analytical Cannabis, and I'm here to introduce the final talk of the day, Utilising GMP and Auditing in Cannabis and Hemp. I am really pleased to have Heather Dupre joining us as your presenter. Heather is serving as the Director of the Patient-Focused Certification Programme at Americans for Safe Access, a non-profit whose mission is to ensure safe and legal access to cannabis for therapeutic use and research. Heather's prior experience in cannabis testing laboratories, as well as environmental and pharmaceutical labs, brings with it years of working to ensure that the products made for cannabis consumers is safe. Heather is excited to continue growing the patient-focused certification program and bring compliance awareness to the cannabis and hemp industry. A warm welcome to you, Heather. Following the presentation, we will have a Q&A session and we would welcome any questions that you may have. Please ask questions using the Q&A tab below the video player. If you experience any technical issues during the presentation, please request help using the Q&A system. I will now hand over to Heather.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. Good afternoon. My name is Heather Dupre, and as Roxanne said, today we are going to be discussing how to use GMP and auditing as a tool for cannabis and hemp operators. I am the director of the Patient-Focused Certification Program at Americans for Safe Access, a 501c3 nonprofit that was founded in 2002, who, as Roxanne said, mission is to ensure safe and legal access to cannabis for therapeutic use and research. There are local chapters in most states, and at this time, we are offering free membership to cannabis and hemp workers as a way to say thank you for continuing to be essential workers during this ongoing pandemic. The Patient-Focused Certification Program is an independent compliance program that started in 2014 as a way to help bring standardization to the medical cannabis industry. The program has since expanded, and we currently offer business certifications in the areas of cultivation and processing, manufacturing, packaging, labeling and holding, dispensary distribution, and laboratory operations. We've also recently begun offering a health and sanitation certification. We also provide training and education courses for the industry that cover areas such as understanding cannabis law and business operations, all the way through the advanced endocannabinoid system. We are also currently in the process of becoming ISO 17065 accredited as a certifying body and are excited to add this additional level of accreditation to the program. Today, we are going to review good manufacturing practices and the Code of Federal Regulations and discuss how to use these as tools for compliance along with hazard and risk analysis and auditing. I'll also discuss some options for certification and accreditation and discuss how these can be used as a way to provide reassurance to customers about the company's commitment to producing quality products. One of the many challenges of the cannabis and hemp industries is the myriad rules and regulations that must be followed. There is currently a patchwork of state rules and regulations for cannabis manufacturers, which can leave many wondering where some of these rules and regulations even came from because they're not consistent from state to state. The USDA interim final rule on hemp production doesn't discuss what happens after the plants have been approved for processing, and the FDA is in the process of establishing a plan for products containing cannabidiol. Where does this leave manufacturers, and what standards should they be adhering to? While following the most stringent pathway isn't the easiest route to manufacturing production, it is the route that is most likely to guarantee that your operation maintains compliance with not only state rules and regulations, but the inevitable rules and regulations that we put into place as the legality of cannabis and hemp products changes. It may seem like a daunting task, especially if you're already operating, but it is a worthwhile one that will prove beneficial in the long run. Good manufacturing practices, or GMP, is enforced by the FDA. It is covered in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations and includes the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, as well as other related statutes that relate to pharmaceutical manufacturing. The most recent revision is known as the Current Good Manufacturing Practices, or CGMPs, and covers things including the design, monitoring, and control of manufacturing processes and facilities. The goal of GMPs is to assure that drug products possess the identity, strength, quality, and purity that they say they do. And this is wording that is also present in many state rules and regulations, and they work to protect consumers from buying improperly labeled products. Title 21 covers food and drugs and has 3 separate chapters with about approximately 1,500 different parts. However, we're going to pay particular attention to parts 314, 111, and 211. These documents are all publicly available through the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, and if you're looking at this as a reference document, you should always use the electronic version because it is the most recent revision. Some of the principal tenets of good manufacturing practices include the implementation of a thorough quality management system, which includes robust operating procedures that provide enough description for employees to easily and accurately perform their duties. This is one area that is extremely important and one that is extensively reviewed during outside audits and should become part of the internal audit process. GMPs also require the sourcing of quality materials to ensure that their usage downstream does not cause harm to the manufactured products. For example, if you are manufacturing CBD products but are not producing your own CBD, the source quality of the CBD should be reviewed and vendors should be approved prior to use. The same goes for other raw materials, such as the chocolate base for candy bars, and also includes packaging and labeling materials. These should be of high enough quality that they will not contaminate or lead to contamination of infused products. The quality management system should also include methods for identifying and investigating product deviations. The goal is to identify deviations so that adulterated products are not released into the market, as it could lead to a potential recall, which can be devastating for any company. But for a lot of cannabis operators who are small, recalls can cost in the millions of dollars and can essentially shut down your business. There is some flexibility in how a quality management system is implemented, but it is imperative that each operation develop a system that works for their employees and their operation as a whole. These systems don't need to be set in stone, but should rather be able to be adapted to changes in the operation's needs and be able to weather potential changes in state or federal rules and regulations. The following section reviews are not meant to be an in-depth discussion, but rather an overview of the depth of the standards and highlight the aspects that are most pertinent to cannabis and hemp operators. Part 314 covers applications for FDA approval to market a new drug. These particular sections should be paid attention to and used as a way to prepare for what may be needed should the FDA allow more cannabinoid-based drugs to enter the market. At this time, the DEA is looking at ways to increase the variety of cannabis-based research products, and recently closed a public comment period that was looking for comments on how they could increase the number of improved cultivators. There's a great need for research products such as flowers, concentrates, edibles, and topicals that are consistently produced within a high-quality framework required by the FDA. Manufacturers who wish to supply these products to research institutes should be prepared to meet the requirements of Section 314. Part 111 lists the good manufacturing requirements for dietary supplements. This and Part 211 are the most applicable sections to the cannabis and hemp industry, and there are many who wish to get CBD products approved as dietary supplements. There are many similarities and overlap between Parts 111 and 211, and it is up to each individual operation to determine which part makes the most sense for them to follow. Part 111 is divided into 16 different subparts, which are aimed at helping operators to identify the standards to which they must adhere. These subparts are intended to cover all aspects of manufacturing, from the physical planting grounds, equipment and utensils, and components, packaging, and labels, through the manufacturing process to distribution. Subpart B identifies personnel requirements, including what personnel should do to prevent microbial contamination to products if they are sick, as well as hygiene practices and personnel qualifications. Subpart C lists the sanitation requirements for both the physical plant and the grounds, as well as the design requirements for the facilities. And Subpart D identifies the standards for equipment and utensils, including automated, mechanical, and electronic equipment. One thing to notice as we go through these sections is that the requirement is phrased as a question rather than a statement, which once we get to section 211, you'll notice is quite different. These next sections highlight just additional questions and information that you want to pay attention to when you are going through these sections to make sure that you're in compliance. Subpart E is looking at design requirements, quality control, operations, specifications. So this is one of the things with dietary supplements, you can establish your own specifications and your own testing and representative samples, but that is going to be slightly different in 211 on the pharmaceutical side. Subpart F is a longer section devoted to quality control activities, including the requirements for review of raw materials, which goes back to sourcing quality materials, one of the principal tenets discussed earlier. This section also discusses packaging, labeling, records, and what the requirements are for product complaints. A number of these requirements are also listed in various state rules and regulations for cannabis, and if an operation is determining which to follow, they should select the most stringent requirement, as it will meet or exceed the less stringent requirement and will survive a change from a less stringent to a more stringent requirement. So as these rules and regulations evolve, one of the things to keep in mind is while the most stringent requirement is not the easiest one to meet, it is the one that is going to allow you longevity. Following up on the requirements of Subpart F, Subparts G and H focus on the requirements for packaging and labels and what to do when components, packaging, or labels are rejected and what is required of a master manufacturing record. For cannabis operators, this is already clearly defined in most state rules and regulations and typically include these requirements listed in Subpart H. For hemp operators, this is not defined as clearly, but the lack of clarity should not prevent an operator from attempting to follow the requirements in either this part or Part 211. Operators should be prepared to follow this section at a minimum. Subpart I establishes the requirements for a batch production record, and Subpart J outlines the requirements for laboratory facilities. At this time, cannabis operators must get their products tested at a third-party laboratory to independently verify label claims and test the product for health and safety, which, as I mentioned earlier, is different from both dietary supplements and pharmaceutical manufacturers who are able to test their products in in-house laboratories. These labs are subject to FDA oversight, though, and are audited regularly by the FDA. Subpart K outlines the requirements for the design of manufacturing operations, as well as the requirements for sanitation and the precautions operators must take to prevent contamination. Subpart L lists the requirements for packaging and labels and what is required for products to not be rejected. And subparts M, N, and O cover the requirements for holding and distribution, product returns, complaints, and product investigations. This isn't necessarily so clearly defined in the cannabis rules and regulations, although what to do in the event of a complaint is typically covered during most independent certification audits. Part 210 begins the section on pharmaceutical drugs and discusses how to apply current good manufacturing practices to your operation. While not quite as lengthy as Part 111, Part 211 contains the standard for current good manufacturing practice for finished pharmaceuticals and covers all of the same items such as buildings and facilities, personnel, equipment, and packaging and labeling. This may be considered a higher standard as the requirements for pharmaceutical products differ from those of dietary supplements, particularly with regard to health and safety testing. The United States Pharmacopoeia lists many of the testing limits for both dietary supplements and for pharmaceutical products. And as you look through those, you'll notice that the requirements for health and sanitation, particularly microbial contamination, are lower than they are for dietary supplements. Section 211.22 identifies the responsibilities of the Quality Control Unit and personnel qualifications and responsibilities. Personnel qualifications are sometimes identified in state cannabis rules and regulations, but if no minimum qualifications exist for positions, they should be defined by the operator. This will also help lead to identification of roles and responsibilities so that there is clarity between employer and employee with respect to their duties and their expectations. Subpart C identifies the requirements for buildings and facilities and goes further into depth than this same section in Part 111. There are some of these requirements that are outlined in state cannabis rules and regulations, such as requirements for design and construction features, lighting, ventilation, and sanitation. But again, if no state standard exists or a standard does exist, but this is more stringent, it is better to lean toward the more stringent requirement in order to weather changing rules and regulations. Just like Part 111, Part 211 Subpart D's requirements for equipment are similar. Covered in this section are the requirements for the design, size, location, construction, cleaning, and maintenance for all equipment types, including automatic, mechanical, and electronic equipment. This section is quite different from the dietary supplement requirement and identifies the standard for the control of components and drug product containers and closures. For cannabis operators, this typically means child-resistant containers for primary packaging and sometimes secondary packaging. What it doesn't allow is packaging for disabled persons who may not be able to physically open a push-down screw-top cap. The primary goal of cannabis packaging is to prevent children from accessing it, while secondarily preventing contamination or decontamination or contamination or reduction of the product inside. This part is gonna really be very key, and what you'll see if you're looking through the actual language of this is a lot of what is written into cannabis rules and regulations, and a lot of it also falls in line with the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. Subpart F contains some of the same requirements for pharmaceuticals and dietary supplements while also differing in some areas. Two differing areas include the calculation of yield and time limitations on production. A number of these requirements are also defined in state cannabis rules and regulation, including time limitations on production, although you'll typically see this more so as they define harvest batches than manufacturing batches. Manufacturing batches usually just require that they come from the same lot of ingredients and the same lot of infused product that they're using to make it. But this is definitely an area that you want to pay attention to as it discusses controlling microbiological contamination as well as inline testing. Subpart G contains packaging and labeling requirements, including the use of expiration dates and tamper-evident packaging. This is something that is starting to gain traction in cannabis and hemp. Right now, expiration dates aren't required for every product, although a lot of food products are now requiring expiration dating. Some concentrates are requiring expiration dating, and tamper-evident packaging can be quite useful, especially as you are packaging up samples to send to a laboratory. If the laboratory is coming in to take the samples from your facility, they should be putting into tamper-evident packaging while it is transported to the laboratory so that they can ensure that the products that were sampled at your facility are in the same condition leaving as they are arriving at the laboratory. And the expiration dating is definitely one that should get paid attention to, because it is a very useful tool to help with the labeling of your product. And if the studies are done correctly, you can extend the longevity of your product. For instance, some concentrates arbitrarily get an expiration date of 1 year put on them, though they are probably stable for a lot longer. So one of the things of doing these expiration dating studies is to really determine with conclusive scientific evidence, is your product degrading during that time, and at what point does it degrade too far, and where should that expiration date lie? Subpart H identifies procedures for warehousing and distribution, which are also similar to state cannabis rules and regulation. There are definitely holding requirements, and there are definitely requirements to transfer product to distributors. As with dietary supplements, pharmaceutical products may be tested and released by in-house testing labs. The testing labs are inspected by the FDA and are required to meet all the parts of this section. This is not meant to imply that in-house testing labs serve no purpose. They can help with product development and research, as well as identify any potential deviations to products before they are released. These labs should adhere to the FDA standard, or at a minimum, the state cannabis lab standard. So internal laboratories aren't prohibited, and testing costs can be somewhat expensive. And if you're doing a lot of research and development, or on cultivars or on different product types, it may be helpful to have an in-house testing lab, just so that you can get the answers faster, you can turn around results quicker, and you can help improve your quality in production. Subpart J identifies the records and reports requirements. This is what auditors and inspectors are going to be looking for whenever they show up at your location. This is the evidence that what you say is occurring is actually happening. These are the standard operating procedures, the logbooks, the batch and production records, the training records. These should identify the who, what, when, and where for each step in the manufacturing process. These steps should also include the before, during, and after activities, and allow a finished good to be traced through the process in the event of a recall. It may seem like a daunting amount of paperwork, but once a system is in place and everyone is trained on it, it can help prevent disaster. Many states have specific rules and requirements with what must be done to returned products. This is no different from pharmaceutical products and dietary supplements. They don't generally tend to approve the reprocessing of returned products, especially if it's returned for a contamination issue. So this is definitely one area where, if you are a cannabis operator, you want to make sure that you are completely following the state rules and regulations with regard to returned drug products and how to salvage returned products. Because this is something that is going to differ because of the Schedule I status of cannabis. In addition to CGMP standards, there are other tools that cannabis and hemp operators can use to help prepare for compliance audits and maintain compliance with the rules and regulations. Hazard and risk analysis can be useful in preventing on-site accidents and reducing the risk of product contamination. Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, or HACCP, is an FDA food safety standard that is aimed at controlling hazards presented by biological, chemical, and physical hazards. They are intended to protect raw materials, manufacturing processes, and finished foods. While this is a food safety standard, it can be applied to other manufactured products, such as topicals and concentrates, as a way to identify points in the manufacturing process where contamination may occur. There are 7 principles of HACCP, starting with conducting a hazard analysis in order to identify these critical control points. Once those points have been identified, limits on contamination should be established. For cannabis operators, limits may already be set for finished goods, but it is important to monitor the process to ensure the quality of the finished products. If a deviation is identified, then a corrective action should be implemented and verified. All of these steps should be documented through established record-keeping processes. The FDA HACCP standard requires compliance with CGMP and the Food Code and models various decision-making tree options that could be adopted by operators. It also requires operators to institute training and education requirements for employees. In the cannabis world, a lot of the food manufacturers are required to have a Serve Safe food handling course, and that is a really great starting point for training and education on the safe handling of food products. HACCP also has specifications for quality management systems, many of which are similar to CGMP requirements for both dietary supplements and pharmaceutical products. These include standards for facilities, equipment, sanitation, training, traceability, and pest control. Pest control is one that we haven't actually seen yet, but it is one that is very important in the cannabis and hemp industry. We want to make sure that pests are not entering the facility. They could potentially contaminate the products. Chemical control is another one that we haven't really seen so far, but it does identify usage and storage requirements for various chemicals that may be on site. It also talks about personal hygiene in addition to the sanitation requirements for the facilities. And so it discusses expectations that you should have as far as cleanliness and hygiene for what your employees are showing up in. There are a number of factors that should be considered when conducting a hazard analysis. Questions should be asked, including, does the food contain any sensitive ingredients that may present microbiological, chemical, or physical hazards? Are potable water, ice, and steam used in formulating or handling food? Where are the sources of the ingredients? What are the hazards that may happen if food composition is not controlled? And is survival or multiplication of pathogens or toxins happening during processing? And this brings us back to inline testing. You want to make sure that through every step of the process, you are reducing the risk of importing contamination into your products. And so we want to make sure that you're testing routinely and at various intervals. For instance, if different mixing stations, if products are transferred to another location, all these transfers and additions of other products can lead to contamination. And so these are types of areas that should be identified. Once a hazard analysis has been conducted, it should be verified that it is working. A verification schedule should be established, which includes a review of monitoring records and sampling and testing to re-verify critical control points. This should be done both routinely and randomly. So in your SOPs, you should be talking about how often you are sampling from your various batches. And if you've actually validated this, then you can start instituting less frequent sampling and testing. But especially in the beginning of a new operation, or if you've added a new process, or if there are issues and there have been complaints, you want to go back through and re-verify and revalidate these critical control points. HACCP records should identify the ingredients used in production, and this should go all the way to any batch or lot number that you're using so that you can track and trace that. The policies and procedures that are used for processing, storage, and distribution, as well as documentation of employee training. Experts can also be consulted when developing an HACCP plan, and they should be used to confirm the adequacy of your HACCP plan. The Occupational Health and Safety Administration provides guidance on how to conduct a job hazard analysis. This hazard analysis is designed to reduce harm to employees and equipment. It is ideal for jobs with a high injury or illness rate or the potential to cause severe or disabling injuries. And this is not always something, because OSHA is a federal organization. Cannabis operators may not necessarily have federal OSHA coming onto their site, but there are state level standards that should be met. And this is a very useful tool, especially if you have a lot of equipment on site, equipment with moving parts, equipment that uses, for instance, butane or CO2 or operates at high pressures. These things all want to be evaluated in order to ensure a safe environment for your employees. In similar fashion to identifying critical control points for contamination, the job hazard analysis is designed to identify critical control points for injury. When evaluating an activity, questions should be asked such as what can go wrong and what are the consequences of this happening. Other contributing factors should also be identified, as well as determining how likely this is to happen. So this is sort of the decision-making tree that you want to go down, and we're going to go through a very quick example of chocolate bar packaging machine. I don't work in manufacturing, but I can definitely identify some hazards already in just looking at this. So one of the things is, where is this happening? Is this equipment located in a space that is adequate for its operation? So if it has moving parts, is it not banging into the wall? Is there enough room to get around this machine to clean it properly? Who or what is this happening to? So it's happening to chocolate bars. Chocolate bars are getting packaged. A person has to operate this. But what are some of these hazards? As we can see, there's cutting devices, there's moving parts, there is technology, computers, there's a lot of different things. So moving parts are especially dangerous if you have long hair, if you're wearing a necktie, if you've got dangling jewelry. So when you see standard operating procedures saying that you have to remove jewelry, tie your hair back, don't wear dangling clothing like neckties or scarves, these are those critical control points that you're identifying where an injury could occur. If your hand gets stuck in a conveyor belt or underneath a cutting device where it's cutting the paper and wrapping it, or if there's heat sealing, there's a potential for burning. These are the things that you want to identify in the steps. One of the great places to start is with the instruction manual, because that instruction manual is going to help you identify those parts without having to actually like turn on the machine and go through it all at once. But these types of questions should be asked for all the different materials. So if you're doing concentrate extractions and you're operating at high pressures, are you working with explosion-proof materials? Are you measuring the levels of gases in the air to make sure that there's not any potential leaks in a CO2 or a butane container? Internal audits are another tool that cannabis and hemp operators can use to identify deficiencies or deviations from standard procedures. They can be used to avoid nonconformances and should be thought of as a preventative action. Internal audits may be done on different systems within an operation, such as a sanitation system, safety system, or a quality system. So for instance, let's say you have a row of first aid kits and fire extinguishers and safety eyewash stations. Those would fall under your safety systems. And so as you're auditing them, that may be easy. Is your first aid kit stocked? Has the water in your eye station been flushed? Are your fire extinguishers rated properly and have been tested recently? So that would help you identify, oh shoot, we need some safety training, or we need to do a fire safety training because people don't know how to use fire extinguishers. With sanitation, did the floor get mopped? Are you checking the records and verifying that people are filling out forms correctly? Are they, following all of the cleaning requirements of their standard operating procedures? These internal audits are really, really useful tools. And while it may seem like a lot, especially if you're getting audited by external companies, this is a great way to help make sure that you're in compliance. In addition to internal audits, there are external resources that operators may use to help gain an understanding of the rules and regulations and how to be compliant with them. Insurance companies are known for identifying and mitigating risk and may be a useful resource. Local fire departments can provide guidance with regard to compliance for both cannabis rules and regulations in the areas of chemical control and fire mitigation, while private consultants, such as professional industrial hygienists and compliance auditors, can assist in understanding GMP and other standards. And certainly things like your local fire department are great resources. They know how many fire extinguishers you're supposed to have. They know, where your firewall assemblies should be located. They can tell you where it is permissible to store certain flammable chemicals and how much you can have on site. You also should consult them with regard to how you should be labeling entryways to make sure that if emergency responders do have to come to your facility, they're able to quickly identify potential hazards that are located inside. OSHA also offers consulting and training, and they have a lot of resources on their website that can be used to help get your operation into compliance and make sure that everyone is safe. So what are some of the common themes that we've seen here throughout this? Throughout these, training and education is a really big one. Making sure that everyone has the proper education and training to perform their job duties is one of the first key steps in making sure that you have a safe operation and that your products are high quality. Standard operating procedures help identify the steps that should be taken, as well as listing any safety procedures or potential hazards that may happen when a person is performing these procedures. So that ties back into training. You want to make sure that they are trained on the standard operating procedures, including all of the areas of hazard analysis. Documentation and record keeping are also key components for GMP and HACCP, as well as all of the state cannabis rules and regulations. So what is the cost of not complying with state or federal rules and regulations? To date, over 30 warning letters have been sent by the FDA to CBD manufacturers who violate not only FDA, but FTC rules. For cannabis operators, there could be state-issued fines and sanctions, which could include suspension or revocation of an operator's license or the suspension or revocation of an employee's state-issued worker badge. It could also lead to a product recall, which, as I mentioned earlier, recalls are expensive. Just a little bit of Google searching and recalls can cost into the millions of dollars, depending on the product and how much has to be recalled. It also is potentially damaging to the company's reputation in the industry. And so product recalls could effectively shut down a company. And so these costs are very high, and you want to make sure that you're doing what you can to become compliant with all of these aspects. There are a number of different certifications and accreditations. Independent providers can conduct GMP and ISO audits, and PFC is another independent program, which is specific to the cannabis industry. ISO 9001 covers quality management systems, and that helps to provide confidence in the conformance of your product to established or specified requirements. Lean manufacturing is used to maximize customer value while minimizing waste. And this is something that is quite prevalent in the dietary supplement and pharmaceutical manufacturing industries, and something that is going to probably make its way into cannabis manufacturing. One thing to keep in mind is if you are looking for outside accreditation or certification, you want to make sure that those providers are also certified or accredited. And so, like I mentioned at the beginning, PFC is actually undergoing the ISO 17065 accreditation process as a certifying body, so that we can really just hammer home the importance of what we're doing in the program and how it can help businesses. So in summary, state requirements are going to be different than federal requirements until the federal government decides to do something. But that doesn't mean that operators shouldn't be working to become compliant with current good manufacturing practices and following what's listed in the Code of Federal Regulations. Because at some point, this industry, we want to continue to legitimize this industry. And the only way to legitimize this is to actually follow rules and regulations. And that's not always the easiest thing to do, but the costs of non-compliance can be very great. And so using tools like hazard and risk identification and third-party certification are a way to help get your organization in line with being able to comply with not only state, but federal rules and regulations. So thank you very much for your time today, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Heather. A fantastic talk to finish the day. I know we're going to have lots of questions, so we'll move straight on to the Q&A session now to try and fit in as many as possible. So the first question we've had is, if an operator is compliant with state cannabis rules and regulations, what is the motivation to adhere to a higher standard?
So this goes back to what I was just talking about. The state cannabis rules and regulations are a patchwork. They are not consistent from state to state, but the federal regulations are. And so adhering to this higher standard is going to allow an operation to withstand changes to rules and regulations. Because at some point, as an industry, if we want to actually get cannabis to be legal fully across the entire country, there is going to have to be federal oversight of these programs. And so being in compliance with these programs now is going to ease the transition later and make it a lot easier on those operators down the line.
Brilliant, thank you, Heather. And the next question, are there other sections of the Code of Federal Regulations that operators should be looking at?
Sure. That's a great one. The Code of Federal Regulations has 1,500 different parts to it. And so it is definitely advisable to look up the different sections. While 111 and 211 are the most applicable, there are ones like 314 or Part 600 that would be useful to look at depending on what you're actually doing within your operation. These are guidelines. There are also things such as EPA rules and regulations that should be evaluated just in the event that you are working with anything that is controlled by the Environmental Protection Agency.
Fantastic, thank you, Heather. And the next question, how should an operator determine if they should follow the standard for dietary supplements or pharmaceutical drugs?
So this one is a little bit tricky just because for state cannabis rules and regulations, there's no clear defined path as to how we're going to go. So for a lot of CBD manufacturers who are hoping that CBD products become listed in dietary supplements, it may make most sense for them to follow that sort of a pathway. But for manufacturers who are potentially wanting to develop pharmaceutical drugs or participate in clinical trial research, they may want to start adhering to the pharmaceutical standard because that is the standard that they're going to have to meet in order to put those products into clinical trials. So it really just depends on, kind of where the operation sees themselves moving forward.
Great, thank you, Heather. And we have time for a couple more questions. So the next question, what other rules and regulations should operators be aware of that may impact their business in the future as state and federal regulations change?
Sure. I've already mentioned one, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. They also, in addition to FDA, monitor business websites and advertising to make sure that they meet the federal trade standards. And so when you see these FDA warning letters, you may see reference to FTC standards. The Fair Packaging and Labeling Act is generally cited in most state cannabis rules and regulations, but it is another one to pay close attention to. And then, there are things like the Environmental Protection Agency and OSHA, these that are also going to possibly have a hand in overseeing these regulations. And so there are definitely other ones that you should want to pay attention to as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Heather. And the last question, implementing a new quality system seems daunting and impossible. What are some steps that operators can take to ease the transition?
Sure. So if you're already operating and you're not sure if your system is compliant, one of the best ways is to seek outside help. If you're wanting to kind of take it on yourself, I think one of the best pieces of advice I can give people is to really just take it one step at a time. So, for instance, just look at one section. So let's say training records, for example. Do your training records meet the requirement? Are they complete? Are they accurate? Are they representative of the employees that you have here? And if they're not, just start working on those. Get training records update. Do people need new trainings? Have their trainings expired? Do they have things like respirator training that they need to take? And so by getting just one thing at a time taken care of, it kind of eases the burden, because then once your training records are flowing smoothly, you can move into something else. So for instance, your sanitation records, your eyewash station cleaning logbooks, your SOPs related to how you should be cleaning floors and walls and equipment and utensils. Start doing one of those, and then, keep going down the line, and eventually all of your processes will be done. It's not something that, especially if you're already operating, you can just do all at once, because it is a lot. And so my best advice is to just take it step by step, do one thing at a time, and then move on to the next system, because as you get further down the process, it's going to become a lot easier for employees and people being trained on these new procedures to be able to adapt to them as it rolls out slowly, versus bombarding them all at once with all of these things that they need to do.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Heather. We really appreciate your time today. Just remind everybody, any questions that we didn't have time to get to will be answered offline as soon as possible. So that's it for today. I just want to say thanks again to everyone who's attended the event. I hope that you've all enjoyed it as much as we have. Thanks too to all of our fantastic speakers and sponsors. You have all contributed to making this an amazing experience for everyone involved. We would not have been able to do it without you. As I have mentioned throughout the day, all of the talks from today's event will be made available to view on demand for 1 month. You can access the talks via the same link you used to access them today. We will be sure to pass on any further questions you submit through the system to the relevant speaker. All of our speakers have kindly agreed to share their slides with you, and these are available within the literature section on the platform. We would love to hear your feedback on the event today, and would really appreciate it if you could complete a short survey, which will be sent out to you later this week via email. All feedback is welcome and will aid us in the production of future Analytical Cannabis online events. If you'd like to contact me directly today or in the future, my email address is available on the info desk section. That just leaves me to say thanks again, everyone, and we'll be back again in September for our 4th annual The Science of Cannabis online symposium, which will focus on cannabis science and testing. Goodbye.